Trailblazers Courtside continues now. Brian Wheeler, Mike Rice joined by one of the fine writers for the great website SheridanHoops.com. This would be Chris Bernucca. Chris, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you guys doing?
We're doing well as in addition. And so you had a terrific article recently about the top 10 point guards, in your opinion. And before we get to the guys on the list, for those who maybe haven't read the article yet, and we invite everybody to go to SheridanHoops.com to do that.
I'll tell you, it's getting a lot of play.
I can imagine. Well, talk about, Chris, first of all, the two criteria that you use to formulate your list.
Well, there were other criteria as well, but I didn't, statistics certainly count. Do you take your team to the playoffs? That certainly counts. Have you been an all-star? That certainly counts. But to me, what measures a point guard, and maybe I should preface this, I'm in my early 50s, so I didn't just fall off the basketball turnip truck.
But you're still a young man.
Yes.
I've been watching this game for a long time, and I can tell you that unequivocally, my favorite player in the history of this game is former Trailblazers coach Maurice Cheeks, because to me, he epitomized what a point guard is. You score when the team needs you to score, but your job is to defend the ball and prevent it from moving as easily as the other team wants to move it. And you get your other teammates involved, and you just run the show on both ends of the floor. And to me, he was the prototypical point guard in my mind. Now, the game has changed a lot since Maurice Cheeks played. But the two criteria were, do you make your teammates better by being on the floor and the way you distribute the ball or don't distribute the ball? And this is also my criteria for judging the best players in the game. If you were to open up a draft right now and have all point guards in the league available to you, and you had to pick a guy now who's going to help you win the championship in June, not a guy who won the championship 3 years ago, and not a guy who's going to win the championship in 5 years, but a guy who's going to help you win the championship this coming June, who would you pick? And that's, to me, is the most important criteria for picking a player of any position, let alone point guard.
Now, with that said, and it makes a lot of sense, when you're starting a team and, the one important piece is that point guard. How did Coach K then, he didn't have access to Chris Paul, Tony Parker, Russell Westbrook. How did he pick other point guards over Damian Lillard, who did everything that was asked of him in those trials about distributing the ball, keeping everyone happy, making shots? How did they go about not – in the last two games, they never played Lillard because they were afraid he was going to have a good game and they were going to have to pick him. How did they pick other people ahead of him? Can you figure that out? Looking at your list, Lillard is number 4 by your criteria. Can you tell us about the Olympic team and why that happened?
Well, I think, and I was not as close to this situation as our publisher Chris Sheridan was. I mean, he's on his way back from Spain right now. He spent the last week plus in Spain around Team USA. And he was at the exhibition in Chicago, and he was at the exhibitions in New York. But he and I were talking. I was watching, and he and I were talking throughout training camp and the entire tournament. And there seemed to be a little bit of politics involved. And when I say that, I think one of the things you have to look at was that Derrick Rose expressed a clear-cut desire to be on the team, to be part of training camp, to be part of the group that was initially invited. He did want to play. And because a lot of what was swirling around the team in June was, the story was guys who were saying they didn't want to play. Kevin Love, Russell Westbrook, LaMarcus Aldridge, as a matter of fact. The fact that Rose wanted to play, I think, got USA Basketball very excited about the idea of boy, we're going to have Derrick Rose on this team. And as things progressed, I think it became evident to some people, and maybe not so much to the folks within USA Basketball, but certainly when USA Basketball was on display for the public, Derrick Rose didn't look like Derrick Rose. And there were players there who looked better than him at the point guard position. I personally think they kept two of them. And Chris and I had this conversation. I think when, as I'm recalling, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I'm recalling, Damian Lillard didn't exactly knock everybody's socks off in the exhibition game.
And that's generally because they didn't want him on the team. They wanted Duke grad Kyrie Irving on the team. They wanted Rose on the team for his name. So there was more than a little politics involved. And they put out the word that Lillard didn't do this. Lillard did everything. I talked to people that were there every day. He did everything that coaching staff wanted him to do. He tried to play the best defense he could play. He was out pressuring full court, which, he wasn't asked to do with the Blazers, but he did it because he wanted to make this team. And yet they didn't even play him the last two ball games in fear that he may look good. So there was politics.
I certainly think that was part of it, and I think another thing that worked against him was the fact that there wasn't anybody from his corner on the coaching staff, whereas Rose had Tom Thibodeau there, and that certainly worked. I think that helped him going forward, because I think whenever Krzyzewski had a doubt about Rose, he could turn to Tibbs, and Tibbs could say, he'll be fine, because Tibbs has coached him, and he's seen what Derrick Rose can do. Now, having said all of that, I think what Rose went through here was a good experience for him, even though he looked borderline terrible.
Yeah, well, it's
Derrick Rose to be.
It was a great training camp.
Training camp.
Yeah, training camp for the Bulls. Who cares about that? The rest of the NBA doesn't want the Bulls to have a training camp for Derrick Rose.
Well, they were going to keep 3-point guards, and I think one of the cuts was a correct cut. I think dropping John Wall was a good decision. But Chris and I both felt that Lillard should have been kept ahead of Rose, and that they probably kind of promoted themselves into a corner, so to speak, and were at a point where they could only keep Rose. And we were still wondering if they were going to, a couple of years ago, the last World Championship in 2010, they took Rondo overseas and then sent them back home on a plane. So we were wondering if that was still possible with Rose, but with Tibbs on the coaching staff, it probably wasn't going to happen, and it didn't.
Well, the last time I looked, Stephen Curry hadn't made the playoffs. There were a lot of people on that team.
Hasn't won a series.
Yeah.
Irving hasn't made a playoff.
Yeah, Irving hasn't made a playoff. So, it was one reason there wasn't a lot of high ratings, TV ratings here in Portland after all that happened.
So
well, I can tell you this. I think Damian's turn is coming with Team USA, and it's just a question of how he's going to kind of approach this. If he's going to be disillusioned by the whole process and say, I don't want any part of that anymore, which would be an understandable reaction.
Yeah, sure it would. He'd look over his shoulder to see if Coach K was standing there with that dagger.
But I don't think that's going to be his reaction.
There's no financial reward. There's a tremendous risk, as we all saw with Paul George. So it wouldn't be unfair to hold that against it would be unfair to hold that against a player if that was the decision that he made. But not every player reacts that way. We've seen DeMarcus Cousins react the opposite way. His reaction has been, I want to be part of that, and I'm going to do all I can to be part of that. And it finally clicked for him this year. And I got to tell you, there were a whole bunch of coaches on that staff on Sunday who were really, really happy that DeMarcus Cousins was on that roster.
Now, let me ask you
Change
this.
that game.
Yeah, let me ask you this about DeMarcus Cousins. He's going to go back to the Kings and say, hey, I'm an all-star. You saw me in the last game. I was great. You better throw me the ball every time. How's he going to react with his teammates without Coach K threatening to not play him? To me, he's going to be very difficult to handle now because of all this publicity he's received.
Well, their coach, Mike Malone, has never hesitated in calling out players in public.
I agree.
A lot of his first year there doing that, he usually called them out collectively, but occasionally he called them out individually. I think one of the things that I'm hoping that DeMarcus can take away from this is that this was a wonderful accomplishment, but in the realm of the NBA, all he has accomplished to this point is numbers. And to tell you the truth, with as strong as the Western Conference is going to be this year, DeMarcus could be 25 and 15, and they could still miss the playoffs. I mean, they 1 through 15. I don't see a playoff team there. So to lay it at his feet, I really think is unfair. I think they've downgraded at point guard tremendously, and they're relying on a rotation at shooting guard of a second-year player who shot 38% from the field last year in Ben McLemore, and a rookie in Nick Stauskas, who he's a rookie. You don't know what you're going to get from him. So they still have a lot of rungs to climb on the ladder before they can start talking seriously about being in the top 8. And I don't know that you can just lay that at DeMarcus Cousins' doorstep and say it's your fault.
So, Chris, lastly, again, to go down your list, John Wall at 10, Mike Conley 9, Goran Dragic 8, Kyrie Irving 7, Rajon Rondo 6, Steph Curry 5, Damian at 4, Russell Westbrook 3, Tony Parker 2, Chris Paul number 1. Absent from the list, Derrick Rose, who we've been talking about, as well as Darren Williams, a couple of celebrated names in the NBA. Why did you leave those two off your list?
Well, I just haven't been impressed with Derrick. Let's start with Darren Williams. I haven't been impressed with him since he's moved from Utah to the East Coast. I don't want to say Brooklyn. He was initially in New Jersey. And I've said this previously, and I'm pretty sure I said it in the article. He appears to be a bit caught up with the idea of the notion and the premise of being a franchise player without understanding all of the responsibilities that kind of come with it. He battled his coach in Utah and won that battle. He battled his previous coach, or second previous coach here in New Jersey and Brooklyn, in Avery Johnson, and won that battle. And you would think that Darren Williams has gotten to a point in his career where, winning the argument with the coach is not really as important as winning the Larry O'Brien trophy. Now, I will give him somewhat of a mulligan that he's had the ankle injuries and he had the wrist injury, so that certainly impacted his play. But there was a time when the year that he took Utah to the conference finals late last decade. I want to say it was 2009. I'm not remembering exactly. But he took Utah to the conference finals, and people were talking about him as the best point guard in the league. And, he was still relatively young and relatively healthy at that point, and I just don't know what's happened to him. He's not been the leader that he needs to be. And as far as Rose goes, don't you actually have to play to be ranked among people who are playing the game? He's played 49 of the Bulls' last 230 games since he's won the MVP, including that year where he won. After that year, he won the MVP in 2011. They played a 66-game season and two 82-game seasons. He's played 49 games in that span. How do you actually rank a player who's played 1/5 of the games that have been available to him? Now, if he gets back out there on the court and he starts doing it again, well, then the rankings need to be changed. But right now, he can't be on the list. He doesn't play. He hasn't played.
Makes a lot of sense, Chris. Good stuff. We'll be looking for all your writing on SheridanHoops.com, a great website and a great stable of writers, and Chris Bernucca, one of those. Thank you for the time tonight, and thanks for your insight, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Chris Bernucca, SheridanHoops.com.